So Israel has no reason to divert any of its attention towards Ukraine because Ukraine is outside of its neighborhood.
Welcome to the second part of my discussion, my conversation with Professor Michael Rossi. In this one, we talk about a much broader geopolitical situation in the whole world, how some countries are allowed to do what others are not, and how this affects these different positions of power that different countries enjoy now, and how this changes in the multipolar world order, and how new developments that happen every so often completely challenges the situation in these countries. Enjoy part 2. It's much longer than the first one. I hope you all enjoy. Thank you all for watching, and see you all next time. You touch again many great points, talking about the geopolitical perspectives from different countries, how everything does not really revolve around Ukraine, although we in the European Union want it to seem that way, because it does for us, because in terms of Ukrainian survivability as a state, we rely on them as a buffer zone between us and Russia, which goes back to the name Ukraine, which means borderland, because it's the borderland between Europe and Russia. I think it's very interesting the way you talk about the negotiation between Trump and Russia, the sort of, I give you this, you give me that sort of situation, because I believe it is very realistic, especially considering the fact that Trump has been saying in some of his speeches, I'm not really sure how much you can trust what he says. He has become more of a politician now than he was before. And at the same time, he's also a businessman, so he wants to sell things. So he may say something just to make a deal and then forget about it once it's over. The point is, he has said at some point the idea between how China is really the number one adversary, rival, potential enemy of the United States, and driving Russia and China together isn't really a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's just more for you to deal with. So I believe he might want to make some sort of deal where, in exchange for example, Ukraine, that they do not become better friends with China, but stay neutral in any potential conflict with China. That way, the United States can have the ability to deal with one at a time, for example. It's just a hypothetical. So the idea that one thing for another, it's definitely possible, because there's so many different aspects to geopolitics than just this single conflict. On the wider area, from the wider perspective, if you zoom out a bit, you can see that there is some exchanges that can take place. And as you mentioned, Trump's, or the United States in general, sending someone under the bus like Afghanistan is also a very real possibility, considering the fact, besides the negotiated deal on Afghanistan with the Taliban, there was also the Trump pullout of troops from Syria, which again is another thing he has been talking about. He said in a very simple manner, he's a simple man in terms of explaining stuff. He says he talked with his military advisors, and he asked them, how many troops do we have in Syria? They told him 5,000. How many troops does Turkey have, Syria, and so on? And he sees himself with 5,000 soldiers surrounded by countries with hundreds of thousands of soldiers. And he asked, well, if these come in conflict with anyone, really, what would happen? They would be wiped out. Because no one can survive with 5,000 soldiers against hundreds of thousands of soldiers. So he decided to pull them out of Syria, pull them out of the Kurdish-held regions in the country. But then they were reinstated under the Biden administration. 900 of them were sent to Syria, allegedly. The exact numbers are unclear. Some say up to 2,000 on different parts of the country. But the point is, Trump has been hinting towards letting them go again, returning home, based on the fact that he says the key in what happens in Syria is now with Turkey. And it is very clear what Turkey's position is with the Kurds, which is the area in which the main US presence is located at. And now that the Assad government has fallen, Russian and Iranian influence has completely collapsed within the country. And with Israel as a neighboring country, which has already started going inside Syria and taking territory there, it is very easy for the United States to remain within Syria and hold their geopolitical influence within the country through Israel. So they don't really need the Kurds anymore. So I believe that something around there, the Kurds may be the next ones to be thrown under the bus. Following that, maybe the Ukrainians, maybe someone else. Because in reality, as you say, Trump is more of a realist than anything else. And based on that, we may see some very cold-hearted deals with different countries, simply to save money, improve the military, political, and diplomatic situation for the United States in terms of the broader geopolitical situation. Because the world is no longer Eurocentric or Western-centric. It is a multipolar world, and the United States now has to negotiate with more than just Western countries. It is no longer enough for them to deal with the European Union and say, okay, there we go, we did diplomacy. Now they have to deal with China, they have to deal with Russia, they have to deal with African countries individually, not as a whole. They have to deal with Asian countries, India. There's so many different countries. And this brings us to something we discussed quickly ahead of this interview discussion. And that is, I have not gotten the proper name for it yet, but so far I'm calling it two-dimensional thinking. And that is something based on the unipolar world order. And it all started or peaked with George Bush's famous words, "You're either with us or against us." And this started a whole era of two-dimensional thinkers and thinking. And that is, you're either with us or against us. The Ukraine war, you're either with us or against us. Well, who is with Ukraine? It is everyone who supports them. Who is against them? Everyone who does not support them. That's not how it works. There are so many neutral countries. But from the perspective of Zelensky, someone like Orban, who is trying to make a peace deal, he's not doing what Ukraine wants, therefore he's against Ukraine. And this sort of situation creates unnecessary clashes between countries diplomatically and between the ideas of people. Because we currently are in a situation where we have to choose between supporting Ukraine and not supporting Ukraine, which makes no sense because there's this middle point, neutrality. And there's also additional points. A good example of this is Syria. Because Syria, there is Turkey, there's Israel, there's the United States, there's Russia, there's Iran. Russia and Iran did not have the same objective in Syria. Russia wanted some influence in the region, and they did that through Syria. They had a naval base, a warm seaport, and they had air bases. They had a lot of equipment there, and they could use it to have some influence in the general area. Iran had it to not just supply Lebanon, but also to increase their own influence and have their own benefits. Iran and Russia had good relations, therefore they could both take advantage of it at the same time. But it does not mean that they are necessarily on the same side. There's also Turkey. They also had their own influence. Now Israel is also going in southern Syria. It's very easy to say, okay, Russia is on the one side, Turkey is on another side. That means that Israel and Turkey are then at the same side. But that does not make sense either, because they have completely different interests in the region. The United States also has their own interest. And you see, the United States and Turkey are clashing over the Kurds. Does that mean that the United States is with Russia in this, while Turkey and Israel is together? You see how it contradicts each other when you just put this two-dimensional thinking. With a conflict like the Ukrainian war, it's very easy to not contradict yourself, because it's so easy to just say, well, you're either with us or against us, because you've either supported or not supported. But if you have to zoom out and look at the greater picture, you have to understand that there's more than two dimensions. And in this multipolar world we're now living in, we were talking about how we are entering it a couple of years ago. We live in it today. And the Syrian conflict is a good example of how it is how we live in this multipolar world, because neither the United States nor Russia had planned for this, nor China. China has not even done anything in Syria. They're just completely out of it. They don't care. Some political or geopolitical thinkers in China has commented on the situation, but it's simply not the main news. They don't really care about it because it's unrelated to them. So we see that the current world order is something that is much broader than it was 20 years ago when George Bush said, "You're either with us or against us," and that simply does not ring true today because there's so many different aspects to, well, the world order.
I think everybody knows this, except for the political elite in Josep Borrell's garden. Like, this whole "you're either with us or against us" is very much groupthink among the gatekeepers of liberal democracy today. Trump may be an outlier in all of this, but even among the political elite in Washington, many of whom I think still desperately want to believe it's 1993, will go on that mantra because it's easy. It's us versus them, West versus rest, clash of civilizations, to use the Huntingtonian theory, of which I'm not a fan of, but I would almost recommend reviewing the book again because he ended up being right on a lot of things, almost in spite of his poor historiography. This is kind of the world that we're in today. So I would say not only are we in now a multipolar world where this duality no longer exists, but we are entering into the world once again of realpolitik, of great power politics, in which the fate of countries, regions, millions of people are going to be decided by what a number of key people in power agree to. So let's sort of begin with Syria here. You mentioned that Russia and Iran's influence have collapsed. Russia's influence in Syria revealed itself to be pretty minimal. And at the moment, they still have the naval base in Tartus and the air base close to Latakia. No Russian soldiers, to my knowledge, were involved in the uprising against the Assad government. And last I checked, the new incoming government of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham said that Russia can continue its presence as long as they cooperate with the new government and recognize the new legitimate authority within Syria. Putin and Lavrov have been rather silent on this, right? They did not issue a call to defend their ally. And by the way, I should also add, we have reports, right, that Assad and his family are in Russia. And yet, unless I missed it, I haven't seen actual photos. I've just seen letters that he has written about how he has, given up power and how he's looking to, I don't know, be somewhat of a leader in exile in Russia. But, he's there at the behest of the Russian government. This might be somewhat of a thorn in negotiating with the new Syrian authorities. They may ask to hand Assad over for some kind of tribunal in exchange for Russia keeping its military, naval, and air base presence in Syria, to which I might even say Russia may throw Assad under the bus if it comes to that, right? If it absolutely comes to that. Iran's influence within Syria, to my knowledge, has been probably the one that's taken the biggest hit. If we were to talk about who are the biggest winners and the biggest losers with the collapse of the Assad government, the winner right now is Turkey, and in particular Erdogan, who achieved one of his longtime goals, which will in all likelihood see Turkey just controlling large swaths of northern Syrian territory because it is inhabited by Syria's Kurdish population, which are the only group that put up some kind of a fight. I agree, rather pessimistically, that Trump may throw the Kurds under the bus simply if Turkey can keep that area under wraps. But we have to keep in mind something here. Erdogan is old, and he's not popular. And there is wide speculation that as soon as he leaves office, his party will lose power because there is just a huge amount of disappointment, resentment within Turkey. Now, that doesn't mean a complete changeover in leadership. It's not that the Kemalists will come back in and reorient Turkey away from Russia towards the EU. We might that's not the case, but Turkey's presence in Syria is going to be a drain on Turkey's already floundering economy. And pacifying the region is now going to drag Turkey into a series of insurgent conflicts, not just with the Kurds, but we might also see the very likely scenario of Syrian Arabs realizing that their country is now being parceled up by Turks in the north and Israelis in the south. Their country is effectively being pseudo-colonized. I would not put it past Syria to enter a type of Libyanization phase. This was my first initial response when I heard about the collapse of the Assad government. I thought, well, the Libyanization of Syria is going to begin. For Israel, this is probably a small, costly, but small blessing in disguise, because what it does is it destabilizes the region to a point where Israel can capitalize on the various fighting and squabbling groups, while it maintains its expanding presence within its own region here. And Trump is most likely going to give carte blanche and a green light to Netanyahu, or anyone for that matter, in Israel. It doesn't matter. Netanyahu can be thrown out of office tomorrow, and he will probably be replaced with an even bigger Zionist than Netanyahu. So in that case, the United States has sort of secured its own interests within that region. To China, to China's whole element here. And will Trump be successful in weaning Russia away from China? No. For a number of reasons. Economically speaking, Russia is heavily integrated with China's expanding economic infrastructural projects across the Eurasian region. This includes the countries of Central Asia. This includes Shanghai Cooperation, One Belt, One Road. China is a key member of BRICS. So the only way that Trump might succeed, and this is a very big if, is if Trump decides to escalate military tensions with China, in which case I sincerely hope that doesn't happen. But if that does, Russia will remain out of it. In the same way that China remained out of the Ukrainian conflict, Russia will remain outside of the Chinese-Taiwan conflict if that arises. Diplomatically speaking, the two countries will remain very, very close. Economically, financially, infrastructurally, there's no question about that. If Trump is hoping to wean Russia away from China and make it an ally of the United States, I mean, that's beyond wishful thinking, in my opinion. That's just absolute naivete. But if we can see in this emerging world of realpolitik a number of regional powers clearly delineating where their spheres of influence are and where they end, this might be something the United States might be able to capitalize on. If we know that Russia will not mobilize to defend China, I don't think that there's a reason why they would, then in that case, it might just be best to then say to Russia, take Ukraine, have your way with it, stay out of the Middle East, and don't interfere with our own affairs with China. And if we see this, the world liberal order has effectively come to an end, and we're back to, as I said, late 19th century, early 20th century, great power politics. The only trouble is that the deal maker is Donald Trump and not someone like Otto von Bismarck.
Yet again, more interesting points to talk about. You mentioned how the different spheres of influence, we talk about, the three different hotspots that really exist in the world today in terms of clashes between great powers, which is Ukraine, the Middle East, and Taiwan. These are the three different hotspots in geopolitics right now, where there's no significant outside presence in Africa. The Russians are trying to help through Wagner, local governments, whether it is military juntas or whatever it is, to kick out the French from Western Africa and Central Africa, while the rest of African countries are really just focusing on improving the different infrastructure and, well, pretty much advancing their countries, industrializing and so on, mostly through the help of China, which is heavily investing into the region, as well as Western countries also investing to sort of compete with that. At the same time, we see countries in the Middle East that are really forming multiple axes of, well, there's the axis of resistance with Iran, Hezbollah, and Iraq, as well as the Houthis in Yemen. Then there's the Saudi, UAE, Egypt axis, which is sort of the central powers in the Middle East. And then there's Israel with, well, Europe and the United States backing it. And then there's Turkey, which is trying to create its own influence there, as well as some support there from Qatar and Hamas in Gaza. These three are sort of working together with the Muslim Brotherhood and so on. So there we already have four different sides in the Middle East that all have potential to clash with each other. And some of these may work together against each other. And that's something very interesting we also can draw from the Syrian conflict, which is that the Assad government worked together with the Kurds in the north to fight the rebels. At the same time, he refused direct conflict with Israel, but allowed Iran to supply through to Hezbollah to fight Israel from the north. So there we see three different factions clashing together. There's the Turkish faction fighting the Israeli faction, and then there's the Iranian faction fighting the Israeli faction. Both of them are fighting the Israelis, while the Arab faction, the UAE, Egypt, Saudi faction, is just staying out of it. They don't want anything to do with it. They're working on industrializing, they're working on building up their economies and militaries before they take any decision on what to do. The very interesting factor is the peacemaker, China, entering the politics in the Middle East, where they have managed to do what no other countries have been able to do since the Islamic Revolution in Iran, where they managed to create a peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which has had very high tensions since the Islamic Revolution, with a rise of a Shia country, Islamic Shia country, bordering Saudi Arabia, which has a significant Shia minority, about 10 to 15%, mostly around the Persian Sea, or Arabian Sea, depending on which side of the sea you're from. The fact that there is this tension that has been there for a very long time, which was then ended by China through the peace deals. And we see at the same time the United States creating peace deals, especially Trump, between Arab countries and Israel. We were seeing a very direct path towards peace in the Middle East, where everyone was really making peace with each other. Then suddenly the Gaza conflict flares up, it completely stops the peace and normalization process between Arab countries and Israel. Then there's the sudden changes in Syria, which again disrupts conflict between Iran and Israel. Some may claim, well, Turkey is somehow helping Israel because they're dealing with Iran, which is fighting Israel. But at the same time, we already see that Turkey is also in its own conflict with Israel. And at the same time, there's the Turkish conflict with the Arab countries. because who are the current Arab rulers? There's the Sisi government in Egypt, there's the MBS government in Saudi Arabia, and then there's the UAE government, all of which are against the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the current leader in Turkey. Prior to the Egyptian coup, there was a Muslim Brotherhood elected president who was then overthrown by the current president of Egypt. And in Saudi Arabia and UAE, there's a lot of political prisoners that were taken based on, well, political differences between the ruling government and these people. Countries such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and UAE have the largest per capita political prisoners in the world, more so than Russia, China, and so on. But this really shows the sort of conflict that there is between these countries, yet at the same time, there's new deals going back and forth between Turkey and Egypt, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, UAE, and so on. So there is this current process where it's kind of a stalemate between all of these different factions, because pretty much every single faction is equal in terms of power. The Egyptian, UAE, and Saudi Arabia faction has the largest population, does not really have that advanced technology, but they have the numbers to make up for it. Israel has the highest technology and the most firepower, yet they do not have the manpower to support that. And then there's Turkey, which is advanced in terms of technology and population, and the same with Iran. They have their drones, they have a lot of new stuff, and with recent help from Russia with electronic warfare and air defense, they're also up to par with modern technology, and they have a lot of people. So the balance of power between all of these countries is very stable, and if one side allies with another, then the third side has to ally with the fourth side to balance it out. But that is why currently we're seeing that there's this stalemate where no side wants to ally with another side, because that would be seen as an aggressive thing from the other sides, and then total chaos erupts in the Middle East. So I believe the current biggest hotspot in the entire world is definitely the Middle East, due to how many different factions there are, and just a single action from one faction can completely disrupt or erupts the whole region into chaos. The Russo-Ukrainian war, although it is a hot war where both sides are actively fighting with massive armies, there's not a large risk of escalation compared to the Middle East, due to the fact that rules are pretty much drawn out. I think the most risky time in the Russo-Ukrainian war is actually right now, between Biden exiting office and Trump entering office.
Mm-hmm.
Because this period is kind of unpredictable, because Biden can kind of say on his last day, well, I'm old. It's my last day of my presidency. I can go to an elderly care home for pensioners or for old people with dementia. Or I can start World War III.
Or both.
Or
at
both.
the same time. Or both at the same time.
There's this risk there where we see Biden right now, between the election and the inauguration of Donald Trump, has gone beyond a lot of these red lines, giving Ukraine the green light to do long-range shots into Russia, giving them more attack and missiles, giving them more support, extra funding, and so on, ahead of the Donald Trump presidency. So there's a risk there where we've seen attackers being shot hundreds of kilometers into Russian territory. But then again, when Trump returns, he has already said he is very much against the green light to allow Ukraine to strike into Russian territory, and many other parts that could de-escalate the situation. So we're kind of at the hot phase. If this hot phase ends in peace, then there's practically little to no risk of escalation. While in the Middle East, it's just constant risk of escalation, and it's just increasing the more balanced the situation becomes, because that's where a lot more can happen. And we see how, through the rapid developments in the Middle East, the geography of the region, it's pretty much mountains and desert for the most part. And that, like, I don't know if you have tried digging a trench in sand. Doesn't really work that well. generally it's very difficult to hide your stuff in the desert. It's difficult to fight a war in the desert with modern technology. Instead, what everyone does in the desert in Iraq, Syria, Gaza is go inside the urban areas, dig some tunnels, and then try to keep hidden as much as you can. But it's almost impossible with satellite imagery, air reconnaissance, and so on. And that's why every war in the Middle East has simply been a hot, direct confrontation where armies face each other off. Something we haven't seen in the Ukrainian war, where there's so many forests, there's so much areas to hide in to avoid detection from all of this aerial stuff flying overhead. So the complete change of nature adds a lot more risk, and the more risk there is, the more fear there is, and the more uh, arrogance and confidence there is at the same time. And this just creates a very dangerous mixture of, well, things that can escalate.
Mhm.
A direct confrontation between China and the United States is also incomparable because it's going to be a naval war. Whoever wins the naval war, well, the war is already over because they cannot really invade each other. You don't see Chinese troops going to the United States, you don't see the United States troops going to China. The fighting will be revolved around Taiwan, and that's going to be it. There's not going to be any land war. Potentially in the Korean Peninsula, if it returns to a hot war. They never really made a peace deal. They don't recognize each other as a country. They still recognize Korea as one country. That always puts a lot of issues and risk of escalation there. But it is likely it will be similar to Korean War or the Vietnam War, where eventually someone's just going to say, this is too costly, we're just going to throw them under the bus.
Mhm. So, well, I mean, I think that even within Ukraine, we don't see what we would want to visualize as a full-scale conventional war. Obviously, Ukraine has mobilized because its territory has been invaded. It is in a total war of survival. Russia has not engaged. Russia has not, Putin has not called, this is why he does not call it a war. He calls it a special military operation, which, we can split hairs as far as the terminology, but he's very careful in not calling it a war, because that would mean full mobilization of the Russian army, which, when he was hinting at partial mobilization a couple of years ago, there was a mass exodus of Russians from the country, and many of them moving towards Central Asia, Georgia, Armenia, among elsewhere. So he's very careful not to call it that. I don't think that we're going to see, like we see in the old history reels of, tank brigades crossing borders and major bombing campaigns like in World War II. We don't see that. Wars increasingly will be outsourced to either private military organizations, irregular groups, and just various ballistic missiles being launched, right, from one side to the others, right? So if people were thinking, after Israel invaded Lebanon, would the Lebanese army mobilize? It's interesting how Lebanon did nothing. The Lebanese government practically remained silent that their southern territories were invaded. It was Hezbollah that responded. And then when we see just the complete and utter destruction of the Palestinian people, infrastructure, buildings, communities, hospitals, children, everything, right? You would think that this would be enough for these Arab countries in the Middle East to respond, to mobilize, and they don't. And that's a difference between what governments officially say and then what they ultimately do. So, rhetorically speaking, sure, these countries can condemn what is openly genocide, although many of the official governments will not call it genocide out of fear of not so much an Israeli reprisal, but just the diplomatic and economic fallout. And it's less coming from Israel and more so from the United States. You know that Israel can get away with this simply because they are protected completely by the United States. And they will be given an even bigger green light and even bigger protection from an incoming Trump administration. What that ultimately means is that countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia and UAE and Egypt are going to try their best to pacify a restless population, right? That genocide is happening just north, south, west of their borders, but they're not going to do anything to intervene. The only group that is doing something about it, and it's indirectly, right, are the Houthis in Yemen. Even Iran's, bluster and rhetoric was more about just enabling Hezbollah, and it took months. It took months before Hezbollah responded. Um, as long as the IDF remained south of the Lebanese border, right, Hezbollah did very little, in response to all of this. So, what do we end up seeing? We see governments make the strategic decision within the Middle East to not escalate conflict because that would bring in full intervention, most likely from the United States. They know China will not intervene. Russia does not have the capability of doing so. And the only country that has some military capability would be Iran. But we've also seen how much Iran is tethered in response to Israeli attacks, missile attacks, general assassinations, and so on and so forth. Saudi Arabia does nothing. Egypt does nothing. Syria ultimately did nothing. The Gulf states do ultimately nothing as well. It's a possible scenario. I don't know, but we have seen occasionally massive protest movements among ordinary citizens within these countries wanting to do something, or at least targeting their own governments for doing nothing. And it's going to be increasingly difficult for these governments to keep a restless society down, especially if the IDF ultimately ends up fully annexing Gaza and either expel. Ultimately, the big thing with the Palestinians in Gaza today isn't the actual destruction that's happening now, but the disease, the famine, the absolute erasure of life. The whole idea is to make Gaza so unlivable for the Palestinians that survive the ultimate conflict that it's a survival instinct to leave. That's ultimately what they want. They want to effectively expel the Palestinians from Gaza. And as soon as that happens, I would be very likely to assume the same thing would happen to the West Bank. Also, another government that has remained unbelievably quiet under all of this is the PLO, is the Palestinian Liberation Organization, right? Mahmoud Abbas has effectively remained, it just become a non-entity in all of this. So what we end up seeing is rhetoric that appeals to the visceral emotions of what people are witnessing every day. But at the end, we see strategic agreements that are made to, if nothing else, keep the money flowing and keep the diplomacy stable. And who are the biggest losers in all of this? Ordinary people. And we see the Palestinians being thrown under the bus, the Kurds being thrown under the bus. We have to also remember about a year or two ago, the Armenians, Karabakh, were also completely thrown under the bus. So how many other people will be thrown under the bus? Ordinary Ukrainians as well, right? That also remains to be seen. And what happens if there is, an escalation of tensions between the United States and China? I also agree. We will not see, military making amphibious landings on Chinese shores. That China will not, all of a sudden try to take Hawaii or something like that, right? The way in which we rhetorically defend certain areas around the world, as long as there is no conflict, leads me also to wonder if China were to make some kind of effort at invading Taiwan, would the United States ultimately defend it? Would they respond with a military response, or would they kind of look at Syria? Would they look at other places and say it's a lost cause? It's not our battle. let the Chinese have it, and we'll just, work out a deal afterwards, right? I don't know. Remember, Trump coming in, I think as far as most analysts are concerned with Trump, is that he's unpredictable. He doesn't follow the usual playbook that you would get from a Biden or an Obama or a Bush or a Clinton or anything else like that, right? He's just as likely to make these, scribbled paper note deals like Churchill did with Stalin in dividing up Eastern Europe and the Balkans, as he is to start World War III, depending upon his mood of the day. Remember, Trump in his first term in office we almost started a war with North Korea just by him trolling Kim Jong-un on his Twitter account. And then he decides to go to North Korea, and the two of them are acting like they're, college buddies, reuniting after many, many years. And the analytical establishment here, just completely losing it, saying, how could Trump go to North Korea? How could he talk with Kim Jong-un? How could he talk with such a horrible, horrible person? And yet, that was quite possibly the most progressive form of diplomacy that the United States engaged towards that country in years, if not decades. So I guess summing up everything that I've been saying here is that, when great power politics now decides the fate of regions and millions of people, you may see an attempt at not further escalating the conflict, but containing the conflict. But within that sphere of conflict, there are going to be vast swaths of people that will simply be sacrificed for the sake of not spreading the conflict further.
I think you touch upon a very important subject that I want to go deeper into, and that is taking a look at the current world situation. What we see as a general trend is Western countries who have been the hegemon, the United States, which was the hegemon of the world, is no longer the hegemon. They are still the most powerful one, but not so powerful that they simply can dictate what is going to happen and what isn't going to happen. And I think a lot of third world countries are taking inspiration from China. China has been able to, practically unopposed, to almost gain control of its entire front yard, backyard, side yard, and neighboring countries. We have seen their takeover since the Second World War of Xinjiang, Tibet, and so many other regions, which has allowed them to really secure their own neighborhood and their own sphere of influence. They simply only lack that of Taiwan. And I believe other countries are taking inspiration from that, where we see, for example, in the Middle East, you mentioned how none of these governments are really doing anything. Many of them are maybe even not saying anything. And I believe that is simply from China, where we see China, when they talk about the previous century, they talk about the century of humiliation. When they talk about the current century, they talk about the century of rejuvenation, where I believe a lot of these countries, especially in the Middle East, following their wars with Israel, they fought Israel 3 times. Every single time ended in, if not complete failure, then without an outcome. Like the 73 war, I could say, not really a clear outcome. But what they see is that while they tried 3 times, their country is still behind in terms of economical power, military power, everything except for population. And they can't simply just throw human wave tactics at Israel to beat them. So just going in and doing something because of Gaza is not going to work out, is from their perspective. So I think they draw inspiration from China in the sense of sometimes you just have to take the humiliation, you have to take the defeat, and calm yourself down, build up the economy, build up the military, build up everything. And once you have everything ready, that is when you can start taking control of your backyard. So I believe Israel is in a very precarious state because what has worked for them is that they could simply provoke other countries to go to war with them and defeat them in that war, which then send them back another 20 years. But when countries do not accept that, and instead Israel is currently the one being set back in terms of economical power, in terms of development, diplomatic efforts, because right now a lot of European countries don't really want to talk with Netanyahu or the Israeli government, especially after the ICC judgment determining him as a person who needs to go for the International Criminal Court for genocide.
I should add that Netanyahu will be not present at the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. So that is a public relations disaster, right, as far as Israel is concerned, precisely because of his fear that he might be arrested for committing similar acts of genocide.
So what we're seeing is that Israel is currently in a worse situation than some of its neighboring countries, such as the Arab Alliance, Turkey itself, even Iran. If they keep the status quo, even with the loss of Syria, if they're able to avoid a direct confrontation with Israel, which is why they've always been lackluster in the response to Israeli strikes, they don't want to escalate the situation. If the United States and Israel does not involve themselves in a direct conflict with Iran, in the long term, they'll be able to improve their infrastructure, they'll be able to industrialize, they'll be able to improve their economy, especially with help from Russia and Russia and China. Every single country beyond Israel is going to grow at a faster rate than Israel itself, especially with the limited size of the population and country itself of Israel. Its neighbors have 10 times its own population. Many times again, because there's so many countries beyond them, and all of them are against Israel. And if anyone believes that in the long term, in the next 50 to 100 years, Israel will become best buddies with its neighbors, simply does not understand people. Because you can say the political leadership in some of these countries wants to be friends with Israel. Even I doubt that, based on the fact that they may want to temporarily improve their relations with Israel to get better economic deals and diplomatic ties with Israel's friends. But in the long term, none of them wants to be friends with Israel simply because the population does not like Israel. And they do not like them based on their actions. They're taking actions which they see from their perspective to be detrimental to their own interest. Anyone who is an Arab, based on the fact that Palestinians are Arabs, are not happy with the situation. Muslims from the entire world are against what is happening in Gaza based on them being Muslims, and so on. So there's so many aspects to what is happening in Gaza, in Israel and Palestine, that is going to hurt Israel in the long term. Even if the current generation thinks, well, Israel is fine, we have had no conflict with them in 50 years, the next 2 or 3 generations are going to have grown up with their TikTok feed showing what is happening in Gaza. Even Western generations, the younger generations in the United States, for the first time in history, the majority of a certain age group is pro-Palestine over Israel. For the first time in the history of the United States. In Europe, multiple countries now support Palestine over, for example, Spain, Ireland.
Ireland.
Apparently, Israel is going to close their embassy in Ireland because of its anti-Semitic dealings, or whatever they call it.
I think they already did.
Yeah, that is for the first time in history that we're seeing these sort of things with Israel. Kind of the immunity of Israel being a Jewish state is going away because of their actions in Gaza and the terrible situation that everyone is seeing on their phones every day for the past year and couple of months.
Mm-hmm.
So we see the situation is definitely changing in the long term. So the question is, are people going to be patient enough to simply let countries that make mistakes do their mistakes gain the upper hand? And I believe that is what the Arab countries, that is what the Muslim countries are trying to do right now, is that they simply believe, well, if we go and fight Israel now, we're going to go another 20 years back. But if we simply wait 5 to 10 years, then suddenly we'll get the upper hand.
Mm-hmm.
And if we look from that perspective, it is very difficult to look at what is happening. Then the thing that I cannot agree with and I don't understand is why they simply, for Egypt, for example, simply don't open the border and allow the Palestinians in. At least save the lives if you cannot save the territory, the country. And then the question there lies with, well, what will be the legitimacy of fighting with Israel in the future if there's no one to defend? So they want to keep the Palestinians suffering in Gaza to have a casus belli against Israel in the future. So
Mm-hmm.
these countries, the leaders, political leaders, are simply sacrificing the people. Again, the people are being thrown under the bus for these political gains that could potentially be gained in the future.
Well, this is, I mean, this is ultimately what I was about to get to, is that let's just say that this scenario that you provided here comes true. Israel achieves a victory, but a Pyrrhic victory. And it solves its Palestinian problem, and ends up becoming a pariah state. They don't care. Their entire the primary political culture of Israel today is the world hates us, the world wants to destroy us. We're used to that. That's why we are constantly on the defense. And if that happens, it's going to come once again at the expense of an entire population. How many people need to die in order to prove a point down the road? I mean, that is ultimately the issue. I mean, I agree with you also in the sense that countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Arab Emirates, the Gulf states, the Palestinians are useful to them. As long as they're suffering, they can at least provide some rhetorical talking points about how there's no need to maintain good relations with Israel. History has proven, unfortunately, that once you get rid of an unwanted population, the rest of the world moves on. The rest of the world moves on. I mean, Aliyev is not under any kind of international condemnation for effectively taking over all of Karabakh. Russia and Putin and Aliyev work hand in hand at this, in this day and age. Croatia's Operation Storm that was meant to retake territory that was controlled by, Yugoslav loyalists, Serb Yugoslav loyalists. I mean, they took the territory back. The ethnic Serb population was reduced to a statistical anomaly, and Croatia's in the European Union. I mean, yes, we can certainly see the plethora of TikTok and Instagram videos of daily crimes against humanity being committed by the Israeli government in the name of the Israeli government against the Palestinians. And yes, you're absolutely correct in that younger generations do not buy into the older Israeli narrative. They sympathize openly with the Palestinian people. I can tell you that at all the universities that I teach at, the students are overwhelmingly on Team Palestine. And of course, the expected accusations of anti-Semitism were met with hysterical laughter, especially when, and we need to be very clear about this, a good number of outspoken students who are sympathizing with the Palestinians and are against the Israeli decisions are Jewish, right? Are Jewish. So it is not this whole you're either with us or against. People are able to see different nuances here. One does not have to be anti-Semitic in order to be against what is effectively genocide being committed against a people. But to be realistic here, as long as the TikTok and Instagram videos remain just that, and they're not translated into political mobilization, the Israeli state knows that they can get away with it. They know this. They're not blind to this, and they don't care. Because if they are given continued support from countries like the United States, the UK, Germany, France, among others, their position in the Middle East is secure. They don't care. They ultimately do not care. If you think that guilt is somehow going to make them stop, they don't care. It's, I mean, maybe a few remaining fragments of the Israeli political left, which is a shadow of what they once were. Most of the Israeli political elite today are conservative to more right wing. The whole notion of political and cultural Zionism has now been given a new lease on life. And we need to also remember some of the biggest Zionists are evangelical Christians living here in the United States. So the country will be protected militarily, economically. I mean, yes, they might be isolated and they might be considered to be an irrelevant outpost of a declining American power. But as long as they remain protected by that power, albeit a smaller, weaker power in a larger multipolar world, I mean, they're going to achieve their immediate objectives ultimately. So unless we see a major transformation of political power in countries like the United States, where taking APEC money or just blindly supporting the state of Israel or just responding as who's his name? Steve Miller, John Miller, who was one of the spokesmen for the White House, right? Remember, as soon as someone says, well, you're against Russia invading Ukraine, but what about Israel taking territory in Syria? And like, well, Israel has a right to defend itself, and it's just a temporary occupation, right? And you can kind of see even some of the journalists looking at him saying, "Do you actually believe your own bullshit? Like, and do you actually believe your own? I mean, seriously, I mean, for allegedly the most powerful country in the world, I would have hoped that you would gaslight a little bit better, because this is just amateur stuff, right? But as long as that leadership, as long as that mindset continues to dominate American foreign policy, Israel will achieve its objectives, and people can be angry, and they can engage in all kinds of boycotts or any attempts at sanctions, whatever. Israeli state won't care, right? They just don't care.
This brings me to an interesting point, I believe, which is you mentioned how Israel, as a state, as long as it receives its support from European countries, from the United States, and how the general elites in these different countries generally support Israel as a country, regardless of what they do. You mentioned this point about John Miller and his Israel has the right to defend itself, which he has said nothing but since the start of the situation in Palestine. We see how there's very clearly given a blind eye to any cruelty that the Israeli government guilty of. It's very clear. We see plenty of evidence, and even the ICC, for the first time in its history, I believe, has sent out an arrest warrant on an Israeli official, not just one, but three, for the investigation of these crimes. And this brings us to the influence of media in setting a narrative. As long as the United States says, well, Israel has the right to defend itself, well, all your arguments go out the window, because they can always just say, well, they're defending themselves, which they have the right to do. How far does defending themselves go? No one wants to answer that, because if they don't answer it, then they cannot be apprehended by it. So they have this vague gray area that they always just use the same arguments to justify it. Ukraine is defending itself no matter what they do. It's justified. Israel is defending itself no matter what they do. It's justified. No other country ever has that argument on their side, because, well, not on these media outlets. If you go to Al Jazeera, you suddenly see that Israel is a genocidal state and they are completely wiping out an entire population, because that is one of the few mainstream media that is controlled by Qatar and not European countries or the United States and so on. So we see that the media has an extremely strong hold on the narrative that is being spoken, because they have the largest audience in the countries that are involved in these conflicts. If we take a look at a country such as China, which is very isolated from Western media, we see that the majority of the Chinese population actually supports Palestine. Normal people support the Palestinian population. That is because they are completely void of Western media narratives. And a very interesting point is that you mentioned this about the Israeli incursion into Syria. That is a very clear, de facto invasion of a sovereign country and a breach of the 1973 ceasefire deal around the Golan Heights, which is also internationally recognized, annexed, and occupied territory that belongs to Syria, but is under Israeli hands. So they're not just starting a new invasion, they're just continuing an old invasion of the country. They say it's to defend themselves. Again, they're just using the same lingo that they've been using to justify every single one of their actions.
So you pointed out a very important word here, narrative, right? And we've been using narrative now for quite some. I use it frequently in political science, especially when we study culture, national history, among others. And in a very brief way of defining it, right? A narrative is a collection of events, people, ideas, symbols, understandings, emotional qualities that are kind of stringed together to create a story. And the narrative is less history than it is an interpretation of history. Right? Now, doesn't mean that narratives are absolute lies. Some of them can be. Others are embellishments on what actually happened here. So you have two narratives that mainstream media has been able to monopolize up until recently, right? The first one is the whole narrative of Israel has a right to defend itself. Full stop. And as long as the mainstream media, here we're talking about the network TV channels, the major newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, even journal articles like The Economist or Financial Times. As long as there is no open challenger to these media outlets of information, the narrative remains untouched and unchallenged, right? So you're reading an article in the New York Times, you might disagree with it, but the only way historically for you to show your displeasure with the article was to do a letter to the editor, which in the olden days, the editorial board decided which letters to publish and which ones to just completely and utterly ignore. You can yell at your TV screen when John Miller or Jake Sullivan or Joe Biden or whatever just issues narratives that are absolutely wrong. That whole story about October the 7th and the beheaded babies and other elements like that, I mean, that has been proven to be absolutely false. But as long as you do not have an outlet to voice your opposition or to show countervailing evidence, the narrative is going to be just simply disseminated and people are just simply going to take it. This is the whole narrative of a country having a right to defend itself. What we have seen in the last couple of years, and this predates October the 7th, but with the rise of social media, and more than just simply TikTok and Instagram, but many Americans, many people in the West maybe have heard of, but they don't use Telegram. And Telegram has a number of channels that show more than just simply a 10, 15-second reel, but documentaries, interviews, on the spot, video captures of literal crimes against humanity happening. It really punches holes in that narrative of a state having the right to defend itself. States don't have the right to defend themselves. States have capabilities to defend themselves. People have the right to defend themselves, right? And so this question of how many Palestinians must die in order for XXX, and the answer is Israel has a right to defend itself. At a certain point, there's going to be enough people saying, why? This is the big question. that people in power fear more than anything else. They give this talking point that they either fundamentally believe or they're told to say. And the last thing that they want is someone in the audience raising their hand and going, why? They can't explain it. They cannot explain it. Because if they explain it, the answer is so ridiculously hollow that no one takes them seriously. So you very quickly begin to see how utterly and pathetically fragile the power base happens to be, right? I mean, even with it's this move beyond the Israeli-Palestinian thing or the Russian-Ukrainian thing, right? The big thing that's trending now in the United States, right, is this lone attacker who shot United Healthcare CEO, right? And the man is becoming a hero to many, many, many people, right? I've seen right next to graffiti signs of Free Palestine, I've seen Free Luigi on subway walls. And the establishment is scared. The establishment is absolutely scared, right? The photos of Luigi being arrested in the orange jumpsuit surrounded by, armed SWAT guards or whatever it is, right? Can you imagine if this man just killed a homeless guy in the subway, right? Nobody would care. It wouldn't matter, right? But yet he kills somebody who is considered rich, powerful, and important, and the state and the authorities need to trip over themselves trying to provide visuals that their position in power is unassailable. I, on the other hand, and most other people see them as scared. They're absolutely terrified that this is going to create a copycat scenario situation. But in this regard, it shows how unconvincing the narrative is from mainstream press. And it also shows how unprepared the mainstream narratives are in responding to simple criticisms of why. Why are you doing this? This doesn't make any sense, right? And the more that ordinary people just simply don't believe the narrative anymore, the less power that they hold on to. They can continue to hold on to power. They can do whatever they need to do in order to hold on to power. But this just creates a greater disparity, a greater disconnect between a small group in power and ordinary people. Now, as long as the ordinary people just simply say, well, this is just BS, this is nonsense, this is just amateur gaslighting, but they don't do anything else, the system will survive. But the minute that anger spirals into some type of collective mobilization, whether at the grassroots level, at the political level, even at the pop cultural level, the establishment realizes that they are much more in the minority than they even thought themselves to be.
You mentioned a very interesting point, and that is whether they believe what they say or are told to say the thing. And a recent article by Al Jazeera, where they talked to insiders from the German media outlet Deutsche Welle, according to employees from the company who spoke anonymously, they revealed pressure on journalists covering Israel's actions in Gaza. They made several points as to what sort of pressure they were facing. Pressure included preventing the term Palestine from being used, providing anchors with pre-approved arguments against pro-Palestinian views during live broadcasts. So they're not allowed to say their own thoughts, they have to say something pre-approved. They held anti-Semitism awareness sessions, reportedly linking criticism of Israel as a state to anti-Semitism. They have scrutinized articles with extreme caution. Despite claiming to oppose racism, Islamophobic and anti-Arab comments were reportedly common in the newsroom. So clear discrimination against the Palestinian side. Claimed videos of children after explosions were fake and suggested not airing them for ethical reasons. So not only is it's not happening, it's also justified at the same time as it's not happening. And it's fine because, well, they are inferior. A manager questioned why Gazans don't hide in Hamas tunnels if there's no safe place. Pre-recorded pro-Palestinian interviews to avoid on-air issues, especially when unsure of guests' positions. So they're allowed to do live interviews with pro-Israelis, but not pro-Palestinians. One journalist remarked having someone stand behind them to decide what gets cut, which was highly unusual. So this is all something that we all assumed was there based on the one-sided reporting of the situation. And this also makes us think, well, if it's this closely monitored in this case, what about other cases such as the Russo-Ukrainian war? What about the Syrian conflict? When the sudden offensive began on November 27th, media outlets were largely silent, and they were incohesive in the terms of there wasn't a common ground between them. BBC said something, CNN said something else. At one point, they called them terrorists. At another point, they called them freedom fighters. At a third point, they called them the legitimate opposition. They didn't know what to call them. A couple of days later, suddenly everything is cohesive between every single media outlet, and they're saying the same thing, the legitimate opposition. Because suddenly they realize they have to negotiate with these guys, they have to create a proper foothold and language at which negotiation is possible. Then the CNN interview came out with Mohammed al-Julani. Then the BBC interview came out, and we see that, well, these media outlets, they have accepted this person is going to be the new leader of Syria. Therefore, we have to create some sort of language in the media that supports that. Because we see how different things happen, and different people can do the same thing, but they're framed different ways to support our relation with them. One day, a leader of a foreign country is a dictator and genocidal maniac. The next day, they are a normal person, and we're going to invite them to our country to negotiate some deals with them, just to justify the actions. So in reality, media is not there to tell us something. And in a democratic country, which we both live in, each our own democratic country, the media and the press is extremely important, because what is the point of a democracy? It is a country based on the will of the people. Well, if the government controls the will of the people through media, then suddenly the government controls the people, which controls the government, and suddenly the government is independent from the people. And it ends up being no different than an autocratic country. Because in the end, what's the point of having elections if you have a choice between a red apple and a green apple instead of different fruits? It is simply different colors on the spectrum, but the policies are the same in terms of foreign policy, in terms of diplomacy, in terms of who is your friend, who is your enemy. Everything is determined not by politics, not by the opinions of people, not by the will of the people, but by whoever is in charge and controls the media, which is typically the one who funds them. So as long as media is not independent from the governance, then the governance controls the media, and suddenly the will of the people is irrelevant. I would no longer live in a democracy, but a pseudo democracy. This brings me to a very interesting point. I read an article by the current Egyptian president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. He wrote it in 2006 in an American university where he completed his military training and education. He talked about establishing a democracy in the Middle East. He talked about how American efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan would simply not work, because they're based on two things. They're based on either a Christian way or basis of morale and ethics and rules and so on, or a secular one, neither of which works successfully in a Sunni majority region. He argued instead that they need to be based on Sunni morals and ethics. Even if they want to be secular, it has to be based on Islamic law. Purely because the people there have their own culture, have their own history, have their own religion, and so on. You cannot take German democracy and copy it and then paste it into Middle Eastern countries, nor American democracy, nor any of the other countries. Which brings me to something you have mentioned multiple times, how a country like Russia, is it a democracy or not? Many people argue that it isn't, but technically they go to an election, they vote, and so on. Some people argue, well, it's not an election because it's not free. What makes it free? You can create fake political opponents who have slightly different views, but the core essence is the same. And then you can claim, well, there you go, it's a free election. There's multiple opposition parties. But whenever something else springs up, like in Georgia, where suddenly someone is not pro-EU, suddenly it is not a real election. In Romania, where the opposition party, who was pro-Russian, suddenly became popular, it's Russian interference. It's not legal. They canceled the election. They canceled the results. Turns out it was the liberal opposition which funded the TikToks, which ended up boosting their popularity, which means that there was no foreign interference. So there is this idea that if you are with us, then it's legitimate. If you're not with us, it's illegitimate, and therefore doesn't matter what morals you have, doesn't matter what ethics you have, doesn't matter who you are. All of this does not matter. In the end, what matters is, are you on our team or are you not? And honestly, I started out being naive, thinking, well, I want what's best for humanity, wants what's best for the world, all that stuff, naive stuff. Because in the end, reality is we are different people who believe different things are best for us. Some may believe that being fully liberal, you can do anything you want, is the best for people. You are able to do whatever you want. You want to go to school, you want to travel, you want to sit at home, do nothing, you want to play video games, whatever. You can just do whatever you want. I don't care. Some may even go a step further and say complete anarchy. There's no laws, there's no regulation, there's no police, all of that. Some may say, okay, we need a police state to keep people in check and to prosper the country, because somehow if you keep people in check, they're going to work and it's going to be great. We have seen through history myriad difference of governments, peoples, armies, and so on. The Mongol Empire was people who in their own mind believed what they did was for the best. Whether they believed they were superior, so they had to wipe out everyone else, or what they believed, I don't know. World War II, Germany, the man controlling it, illegal name, he believed what he did was the best because Germans were superior. They just needed some living space, they just needed to prosper. Because, well, no one else can do it as best as they can. And that is simply another reality we live in. Western people, European countries, United States, they believe that their way of life is the best, it is the superior one. That means everything else is insignificant in comparison, and everything else is wrong. What they do is right. I went to a military forum where they talked about the doctrine in NATO countries, the NATO doctrine, where they really have this sort of blitzkrieg doctrine, where they will kind of encircle the Russian army if they invaded and then suddenly wipe them out first week of fighting. They don't really need a plan B because plan A is going to work. Why is it going to work? Well, they decided it's going to work. They're superior. So the whole doctrine is based on that. They went to fight in Afghanistan, they went to fight in Iraq, they made the change the whole doctrine to be counterinsurgency based because, well, no one can threaten them anymore. So they just need to figure out how to deal with these insurgencies because there's no war that can be fought because we're just going to win the war. Why? Because we are right. We're superior. This superiority complex is completely ruining the way of life and the diplomatic, economical, and everything situation in the West. We are destroying ourselves through all of this arrogance.
Well, a number of things to respond to with that. Let me start from the beginning, where we were still talking about media. We were still talking about media and information, and of course the role of narrative. There is this persistent belief that media is free and independent in the West, and it's state-controlled propaganda in the rest. Russian media is state-controlled, it's propaganda. Russian media is basically like American media. It is independent, but it's corporate run, and it has an agenda, right? Like most media outlets do. The goal is not to inform, but to affirm. Right, let me say that again. Most media outlets, most state media outlets that represent a particular country, affirm, not inform. The worst thing that could ever be to a group of power brokers is a truly independent media. There's a different, and better yet, I should not even say independent media, independent journalism. Media is one thing, journalism is something else. Journalism is fact-finding. Journalism is exposing the inconvenient truths, not just for your enemies, but for your own side as well. And if given full reign to do what it wants, independent journalism would effectively implicate all sides. Independent journalism would eliminate the yin-yang dichotomy between us, the good guys, and them, the bad guys. Independent journalism would reveal that as much as the West praises Ukraine as some paragon of liberal democracy defending European values against the barbarian hordes of Russia, since the outbreak of conflict almost 3 years ago, the Zelensky government has passed countless rules, decrees, and executive orders that have all but marginalized and demonized anyone that speaks Russian, identifies as Russian, or goes to the wrong church. Any particular political group that wants a ceasefire, that wants a pragmatic solution, is deemed a traitor to the state. Now, this is left out largely from Western media that wants to portray Ukraine as the scrappy little country that is holding its own against Russia. And if all that one does is listen to what used to be, even the New York Times and the Washington Post every so often can't help themselves. They have to report more harsh, uncomfortable realities on the ground. But if you truly just believe that, then if you truly follow those media outlets, you're going to believe this very sanitized narrative. The Telegram channels, the non-Western media outlets portray something quite different. The same thing goes for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the civil war in Syria, the fall of the government. I like the fact that CNN, put pronouns next to Abu Muhammad al-Jolani's name, because apparently Salafism is now intersectional or something like that, right? Come back in a couple of months and tell me how the Christian population of Syria is faring. Because if they end up like the Iraqi Christians, well, then there's a reason why many, many people were not happy with the collapse of the Assad government. And no, one does not have to be pro-Assad. One does not have to be a tanky or whatever it is in order to see the fallout of the security fallout of the Ba'ath regime once it is overthrown. This goes to a larger point about the role of democracy. And, as democracy becomes more and more digitized, as globalization, and I teach a class on globalization, more than just simply economic integration, but I talk about globalization from a cultural, from a consumerist, and from a political democratic point of view. Globalization is the ultimate democratizer. If left to its own devices, it's the ultimate democratizer. And in that, globalization provides the democratization of information. We were just talking about this beforehand. In the olden days, the powers that be controlled the narrative. They put it in the newspapers. They put it in the 6 o'clock evening news, and people took it as is. If you didn't believe it, no one cares because you don't have a voice. Today, comment sections in articles will show what the public really thinks. Telegram channels, internet, podcasts, social media, TikTok. We know the joke. We are talking about this right now, right, on YouTube. And it doesn't mean that we are about to topple the voice of the Ministry of Truth, but it shows, once again, how skeptical people really are. So to this point of democracy, and this has been written about now for decades, even before the end of the Cold War, and that is, what exactly is a democracy? I mean, what do we, you go to political science classes and you learn about the three branches of government and the political system and the founding fathers, and it's a very brochure-oriented, very pro-institutional understanding of democracy. Democracy in its raw form is messy, it's dirty, it's chaotic. It ultimately is what the people want. And, we like to think that democracy works when certain virtues are upheld. But history has shown that democracy, if we understand what it is that the people want, upholds some rather unsavory values, right? So just thinking as I was listening to you beforehand, we were to go back in time to the segregationist South, right? Jim Crow laws. And this was within many Americans' lifetime. The George Wallace period, where people would absolutely lose their minds if certain people of color sat on the wrong seat in the bus or entered into the wrong door or drank from the wrong water fountain. If you were to go back in time to that era and ask the people within those communities, are you a democratic society? They would say, absolutely. We are an absolute democratic society. Our elected officials are representing our own views. I mean, that is effectively functional democracy. Functional democracy brings a number of unsavory individuals, a number of absolutely immoral political parties to power. We like to think, liberals like to think, all we have to do to defend to defeat Donald Trump is to vote him out. A lot of good that did you. What did that end up doing? And then at the same time, many of these pro-democratic individuals espouse the sanctity of institutions and a system that has systematically worked to disenfranchise millions of Americans. And they do so all for the sake of bipartisan compromise, which, if you are within that privileged circle, it's going to benefit you. But if you're not, you're going to be those people that write Free Luigi or Free Palestine on subway walls. And that scares the establishment because for them, that's the masses, that's the rabble, that's chaos. So ultimately, democracy is managed by those in power. And it's a managed affair, not just in places like Russia or Turkey or Belarus or something like that. It's managed even here in the Western world. You mentioned a number of elections that were almost scuttled, right? The Romanian presidential election was, I think, postponed because all of a sudden the presidential candidate who came out on top is allegedly pro-Russian, right? In the same way that Robert Fico is pro-Putin. He's not pro-Putin. He is pro-Slovakia, right? It's like the guy in Romania, pro-Romanian. And yet there were elections in Moldova that went in the favor of the liberal democratic West. And how did that happen? The diaspora vote throughout the EU allowed the pro-EU, the pro-Western candidate to win. What about diaspora votes of Moldovans in Russia? Only two, if I was understanding, only two polling stations were open. So it's effectively a way of filtering, funneling votes in the way that you want towards a desired outcome. This election was free and fair, right? The one in Georgia, this one is Russian interference. Trump wins, Russian interference. Romania, Russia, everything that the West doesn't like is Russian interference. I think at one point, I forget whether it was, I think it was Putin who said this, not Lavrov, but Putin. At one point he said, you know, if Russia were as capable as the West likes to make us out to believe, we wouldn't have lost the Cold War. But it's a narrative that people will simply take on faith because they cannot process the reality that what they have been taught to believe is little more than just simply a myth. It's sort of like spectator sports, whether it's in Europe or the United States, right? You have people that will viscerally, emotionally back a team, whether it's a football team, baseball, basketball, whatever, it doesn't matter, right? And it's like, if this team has chronically lost every single year, it's one of the worst teams out there, but for some strange reason, you just love this team. I always have to ask, why? Like, what's your whole thing? I mean, why do you go through this emotional stress when you know that your team doesn't win? You know that your team will never. The last time the Jets advanced to the Super Bowl was, well beyond the living age of many people today. I think that this is part of the whole thing, is that the cognitive dissonance that comes in when reality dictates otherwise to the narrative that you are wedded to, you don't change the way that you think, you just entrench yourselves even further. Mm-hmm. Right? You entrench yourselves even further because you don't want to be informed, you want to be affirmed. Right? That's ultimately what it is. And I think that this also plays into this idea that, Russia during this entire military operation in Ukraine, I mean, yeah, the jingoism certainly is there, especially from people like Medvedev. But Medvedev he's paid to basically be like that. Putin, Lavrov, Zakharova, they've all been tempered in their assessment, right? For them, like Belousov had said in the beginning of our conversation, right? We hope in 2025 to achieve all of our military objectives. It's not in the same way when the United States goes to war with a country, right? The entire pop cultural industry gets behind it. Let's create a Hollywood movie around it. We're going to, kick their ass and take their gas and we win and whatever. Until we go up against, a third world country, in which case we lose by war of attrition, whether it's Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. The American military is very much attuned to going up against a conventional army. When it's basically the entire population, sure, we can occupy a country for 20 years, and then we leave it in 20 hours and it goes right back to where it was beforehand, right? And then we just completely forget about it as if, things never really happened. To this, I believe that this is a large part of the West's cognitive dissonance. The idea that you're right, you're absolutely right. The West is no longer the global hegemon. The United States is no longer the global hegemon. It is a global power. And I've been saying this for years. No one denies that. Putin doesn't deny that. China does not deny that. But the idea that the United States now has to somehow share the global spotlight with 2, 3, 4 other countries on some kind of parity is insufferable to people who rose through the political ranks thinking that Rome is the light and we are the modern day Roman Empire. Rome collapsed, Persia collapsed, every major civilization comes and goes. It's not saying that America is collapsing, but America, the United States, the West is having to come to the sobering reality that Maintaining global peace and security cannot be done by one country alone, and it needs to be done in cooperation with some countries whose own foreign policies and ideological objectives are at best slightly different from ours, and at worst counter ideological. But you need to make peace with this. I don't know if Trump is going to do this. Somehow I doubt it. But a realist, a constructivist, a realist is much more likely to come to that reality than an ideological Wilsonian liberalist.
All right, that's a lot to swallow. And I think we're actually nearing the end. We've been talking for 2.5 hours almost.
We can break this up into various chapters here.
I'm thinking of doing that, but I just need to know how to balance it, both in terms of having the same topic going through, but also holding the viewership up. Because unfortunately, this is the ever going circle of independent media or independent journalists. To do something, you need funding. You need money to do something, whether it is to just survive, the equipment you need, and everything else. So you need money. That is the first point. You can either get crowdfunding, which requires viewership. And again, what do people want? They don't want to be informed, they want to be affirmed. So you will end up being an echo chamber, affirming people's opinions to get that crowdfunding. Or you get funded by someone else. And then suddenly, everything you do is based on their whims, because they can just withdraw the funding if they disagree with what you say. So, unless someone who is a saint comes and funds you, you're going to be dependent on either people in a crowdfunding manner, or you have to appeal to the masses in a populist manner, like democracies, or you have to be funded by someone specific, and then you end up being lobbied by a specific agenda. Which is what we see with every single media. If they are completely independent, they're being crowdfunded, they have to get clicks. If they're not independent, they have an agenda. But with that, we're going to end off this very interesting talk I had with Professor Michael. You can check out everything he's worked on. Put a bunch of links in the description for whatever takes you to him. And thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.
Thank you for having me.